Right now, somewhere, an alarm is about to go off. It will drag someone out of sleep and straight into a to-do list, a commute, a login screen, a calendar full of blocks that decide hour by hour what a human being is allowed to do with their own time. Now imagine deleting all of it. No alarm, no login, no calendar. Just a day, completely unowned by anyone else. Your first reaction might be dread. What would you even do with yourself? But the real answer is far stranger than dread. For the overwhelming majority of human history, this wasn't a crisis. It was simply how a day worked. Your ancestors did not have jobs. Not the kind, you know. No manager assigning tasks. No fixed hours. No sense that a portion of their life had been sold in exchange for survival. And yet they lived. They raised children. They built languages, myths, tools, and relationships that held entire communities together for tens of thousands of years. So the question isn't really whether ancient humans were busy. It's what they were busy with. Start with a number that tends to break people's assumptions immediately. In the 1960s, anthropologist Marshall Solins studied hunter-gatherer societies and arrived at a conclusion that shocked much of the academic world. He called it the original affluent society. Not affluent in the sense of owning more things. Affluent in the sense of owning more time. Solins looked closely at groups such as the Jew/Hoansi of the Kalahari Desert, people often assumed to be locked in a desperate, non-stop struggle against starvation. What he found instead was startling. These communities were spending roughly 15 to 20 hours a week acquiring food. 15 to 20 hours. That's less than a part-time job. That's less time than many people spend today just answering messages and sitting in traffic. Sit with that for a second. You've probably pictured prehistoric life as brutal, exhausting, an unrelenting fight to survive one more day. But the evidence tells a very different story. Survival did not demand non-stop labor. It demanded skill, cooperation, and a deep practiced knowledge of the land. So if they weren't working most of the day, what filled the rest of it? This is where anthropologist James Sussman's research becomes essential. Sussman spent years living among and studying the Jew/Hoansi, and he documented something that modern life has almost entirely erased. The hours outside of foraging were not empty. They were full. Full of rest without guilt. Full of long conversations. Full of naps taken freely in the shade, with no internal clock demanding productivity in return. You probably can't remember the last time you rested like that. Even your relaxation today tends to come with a timer quietly running in the background. Picture an actual day. Morning might involve a short trip to gather plants or check for signs of game. As the sun climbed and the heat became dangerous, people retreated into the shade. This detail matters. Ancient humans were not grinding through the hottest, harshest hours the way modern work culture insists you should. They paused. They waited it out. As the day cooled, there might be more foraging, some toolmaking, or a parent quietly teaching a child how to read tracks in the dirt. Then evening came, and this is where something remarkable happened. Researcher Polly Wiesner studied the Jew/Hoansi specifically to understand what nighttime conversation was actually for. She compared daytime talk to nighttime talk and found a sharp, consistent pattern. Daytime conversation tended to be practical. Complaints, coordination, small disputes. But once darkness fell and fires were lit, the tone shifted completely. Conversation turned to stories, myths, distant relatives, humor, memory. Wiesner's research suggested that firelight itself may change how people think. Without the visual clutter of daylight pulling attention outward, minds turned inward, toward imagination and connection. This is where culture was actually built. Not in a workshop, not on a clock, around a fire at night with nowhere else to be and nothing else demanded of them. Think about how much of what you value most today still traces back to that exact pattern. A song that gets stuck in your head for weeks. A story a grandparent told you once that you still repeat to your own children. A joke that only makes sense inside your family. None of that came from a task list. It came from unhurried time spent with other people with nothing more urgent to attend to than each other's company. It's worth pausing on just how much information moved through those fireside hours. Wiesner found that a huge share of nighttime talk was what researchers call social mapping, tracking who was related to whom, who had wronged whom, who might be a good ally 3 valleys away. This wasn't idle gossip in the dismissive sense. It was how a small band kept tabs on an enormous invisible network of relationships stretching far beyond what any single person could see with their own eyes. In a world with no written records, memory carried through story was the only archive there was. Here's where the story should start to feel uncomfortable, because it directly contradicts what you were likely taught. You were taught that agriculture and permanent settlements rescue humanity from chaos and hardship. That fields, grain stores, and cities were an upgrade, comfort replacing struggle. But when researchers compared the skeletal remains of early farmers to those of earlier hunter-gatherers, the results were unsettling. Farmers were frequently shorter. Their bones showed more evidence of disease, malnutrition, and repetitive physical strain. Hunter-gatherers, for all their supposed precarity, tended to be taller and, in many measurable ways, healthier. Why? Because farming demanded relentless, repetitive labor tied to a single, immovable patch of land. Planting, weeding, harvesting, defending stores from pests, rot, and raiders. A single failed season could mean starvation, because unlike a forager who could simply move toward wherever food existed, a farmer was anchored in place. So the relaxed rhythm of early human life wasn't lost because existence became easier. It was lost because a new system became better at producing surplus, and eventually someone figured out how to make other people generate that surplus for them. That's the real story hidden behind no jobs. It isn't that ancient humans were lazy. It's that survival didn't yet require the kind of specialized, scheduled, externally measured labor you now call employment. Nearly everyone understood how to do nearly everything needed to live. There was no supervisor, no performance review, no sense that your worth as a person was tied to your output. Think about what that meant for how time itself was experienced. Without clocks, without a day divided into billable segments, time moved according to different signals entirely. It moved with the sun, with the seasons, with hunger and rest. Anthropologists describe this as task orientation rather than time orientation. You don't begin work because a clock reads 9. You work because a task is in front of you, and once it's finished, it is genuinely finished. Ask yourself honestly, when did you last feel truly done for the day? Not collapsed from exhaustion. Actually complete, with nothing quietly waiting for you. This task-based rhythm meant that so-called free time and work time weren't strictly separated at all. There was no hard boundary. Storytelling, toolmaking, teaching children, resting, playing, all blended together across the hours. Nothing was leisure in the way you think of leisure now, something earned only after obligation has been fully discharged. It was simply life unfolding. Historian E.P. Thompson traced how this changed. His research into early industrial England showed how factory owners had to actively retrain an entire population out of task orientation and into time orientation. Workers accustomed to stopping when a task was done had to be taught, often through fines and punishments, to instead obey the clock itself. Bells replaced the sun. Shifts replaced tasks. What feels to you like the natural order of a working day was, in historical terms, a fairly recent and deliberately engineered shift in how humans were made to relate to time. Here's where it gets stranger still. Some researchers argue that this constant blending of activity and stillness wasn't just pleasant. It may have been necessary for how the human brain actually developed. Cognitive scientists have long emphasized the importance of unstructured mental time, sometimes referred to as the default mode network, for creativity and problem solving. When your brain isn't locked onto a specific task, it doesn't switch off. It wanders. It quietly links ideas that would never otherwise touch. Some researchers studying hunter-gatherer cognition have proposed that the long, unscheduled hours ancient humans spent resting, talking, and simply existing without a task may be exactly what allowed innovation to occur at all. New tool-making techniques, new hunting strategies, songs and myths that encoded survival knowledge for the next generation to inherit. In other words, what looks like idleness may have been the engine of human intelligence itself. You now live inside a world engineered to eliminate that state entirely. Every idle second gets filled. A phone appears the instant a line moves slowly. A show plays while you eat. Music fills a quiet walk. Your ancestors sat by firelight in relative silence, or in slow, unhurried conversation, for hours, night after night, across tens of thousands of years. Your brain evolved expecting that kind of open space. You almost never give it that space anymore. There's a modern mirror here worth pausing on. Researchers studying hunter-gatherer patterns of rest have sometimes compared it, half-jokingly, to retirement. Not the anxious, financially precarious retirement many people fear today, but something closer to what retirement was originally imagined to be. Time with no attached obligation. Time spent because you wanted to, not because a system required it of you. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, known for her research into human longevity, proposed something called the grandmother hypothesis. She observed that human women often live for decades after they can no longer bear children, which is unusual among mammals. Her theory suggests this extended lifespan evolved specifically because older individuals, no longer tied to producing food for their own offspring, could use that unstructured time to help raise grandchildren, pass down accumulated knowledge, and strengthen the group as a whole. Time without a job, in other words, may be one of the most important evolutionary innovations humans ever developed. Not an accident of survival, a deliberate survival strategy in itself. Sit with that for a moment. The absence of constant work wasn't a flaw in the system. For most of human history, it was the system. There's also the matter of sleep itself, which turns out to be one of the more surprising threads in this story. Neuroscientist Jerome Siegel led a study monitoring the sleep patterns of 3 remaining hunter-gatherer and forager-horticulturalist groups, including the Hadza, using wearable sensors rather than relying on memory or guesswork. The results overturned a popular assumption. These groups were not sleeping for 10 or 12 hours a night, the way people often imagine natural sleep should look. They averaged around 6.5 hours, remarkably close to what many modern adults get. But the timing was different. They didn't go to sleep the moment it got dark, and they didn't nap constantly through the day either. Instead, sleep followed body temperature and the natural cooling of the environment after sunset, not an arbitrary bedtime, and certainly not an alarm forcing an unnatural wake-up. The point isn't that ancient humans slept more. It's that their sleep, like everything else in their day, was allowed to follow an internal signal instead of an external demand. Consider also how children fit into this rhythm. Anthropologists studying groups like the Hadza of Tanzania have observed that children were rarely handed structured lessons. Instead, they learned by tagging along, by watching an adult flake a stone tool or track an animal, and by playing games that quietly rehearsed adult skills. There was no separate category called school, walled off from real life. Learning simply happened inside the same unhurried rhythm as everything else. A child absorbed an enormous amount of practical knowledge without ever sitting through anything resembling a lesson plan. So what actually filled an ancient human's day, from morning until the fire finally burned low? Foraging, but only for a handful of hours. Tool-making, done with care, sometimes functioning as much as expression as necessity. Teaching, almost always informal. Children absorbing skills by watching rather than sitting through lessons. Storytelling, especially after dark, weaving memory and meaning into something that could survive generations. Play for children, and often for adults too. Genuine rest, without guilt attached. And conversation, constant conversation, the kind that built alliances, resolved conflict, and turned scattered individuals into something recognizable as community. None of it looked like productivity in the modern sense. All of it was essential. It's worth naming what wasn't part of that day too, because the absence is just as telling as the presence. There was no separate category of work clothes and off-duty clothes. No sense of dreading Monday because there was no Monday, no 5-day countdown toward 2 days of freedom. No performance metrics whispering that you hadn't done enough today. No comparison to a stranger's curated version of their own day because there was no feed to scroll, no audience to perform for. Whatever anxiety existed came from real, immediate threats, a predator, a storm, an illness, not from an abstract sense of falling behind in a race that never actually ends. Now compare that to an average day now. Waking up already behind. Checking messages before your eyes have fully adjusted to daylight. Moving through tasks assigned by someone else, measured against targets you didn't set, inside a system that treats your time as a resource to extract rather than a life to live. Even rest gets optimized. Sleep tracked by an app. Meditation scheduled into a calendar slot. Hobbies slowly monetized into side projects, because unstructured time now feels almost suspicious, almost wasteful. You are not fully built for this. Not entirely. Your brain, your body, your internal sense of rhythm evolved inside a world where the day breathed in and out, task and rest, sun and shade, conversation and silence, in a pattern with no fixed schedule attached to it. None of this means the modern world was a mistake. Agriculture, cities, and medicine brought real, undeniable gains ancient humans never had. Fewer deaths in infancy, less daily exposure to predators, famine, and violence. But something quieter was traded away in that exchange, and it deserves to be named honestly. The wide-open, unscheduled day. The evening fire with nowhere else to be. The sense that time belonged to you, not to a clock, not to an employer, not to a notification demanding your attention. There's one more piece worth adding, because it explains why this rhythm wasn't fragile, even though it looked unstructured from the outside. Seasons mattered enormously. During periods of abundance, when food was easy to find, the balance tilted even further toward rest, ceremony, and long-distance travel to visit other bands. During leaner stretches, foraging hours increased, sometimes considerably, and the group tightened around practical survival. This flexibility is easy to miss if you only picture one static, typical day. The real pattern was closer to breathing. Expansion during plenty. Contraction during scarcity. Always adjusting, never locked into a fixed schedule the way a modern job locks you into the same hours regardless of how you feel or what the world around you is doing. Maybe the goal isn't to abandon the modern world and return to the Kalahari. That's not realistic, and honestly, most ancient humans would have happily traded some of their leisure for modern medicine if they'd had the choice. But there's something worth borrowing from that older rhythm, even in small pieces. An evening with no screen competing for your attention. A stretch of time with no task attached to it, where your mind is simply allowed to wander. A conversation that isn't scheduled, rushed, or interrupted by a notification. So the next time an empty weekend stretches out in front of you, and that old unease starts creeping in, what now? Pay attention to it. Notice how strange it is that unstructured time makes you anxious. Your ancestors didn't experience that anxiety. They knew exactly what open time was for. It was for talking, for resting, for teaching, for wondering, for simply existing in a day that never needed to be filled in order to matter. Right now, somewhere, an alarm is about to go off. It will drag someone out of sleep and straight into a to-do list. But somewhere else, someone is sitting by a fire with nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove.